When people imagine the history of education, they are often shown a single direction: knowledge rising in Europe and spreading outward to the rest of the world. But that story keeps one crucial truth in the shadows. Long before Europe standardized universities, Africa was already teaching, preserving, debating, and expanding knowledge, not in isolation, not by accident, but through organized systems of learning that lasted centuries. Africa did not wait for education to arrive. Africa produced it. Long before colonization, education in Africa was deeply woven into society. Knowledge was not separated from life. It shaped governance, spirituality, medicine, trade, and law. Some learning was written, some was oral, some was spiritual, some was scientific. All of it was intentional. One of the most powerful centers of African learning rose along the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, where trade routes met ideas: Timbuktu. Today, Timbuktu is often spoken of as a myth, a symbol of something distant and exaggerated. But here's what they don't tell you. In its height, Timbuktu was one of the most important intellectual cities in the world. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Timbuktu had become a hub of scholarship, attracting students, teachers, jurists, astronomers, and philosophers from across Africa and beyond. They didn't come for gold, they came for knowledge. At the heart of Timbuktu stood institutions like Sankore, Jingerebe, and Sidi Yahya, not just mosques, but full centers of higher learning. Sankore University, in particular, functioned as a structured institution. Students advanced through levels of study. Teachers were respected scholars. Knowledge was certified through mastery, not attendance. This was not informal learning. This was higher education. Subjects studied included mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, grammar, logic, theology, geography, and history. Timbuktu's libraries held hundreds of thousands of handwritten manuscripts. These texts were copied by hand, preserved in family collections, and passed down through generations. Some manuscripts discussed surgical techniques. Others mapped the movement of stars and planets. Some debated ethics, governance, and law. Others recorded African history in African voices. And here's what matters. These manuscripts still exist today. They prove that Africa was thinking, writing, and teaching, while the world later claimed it was silent. But Timbuktu was not alone. Across North Africa, institutions of learning flourished. In Cairo, Al-Qarawiyyin and Al-Azhar stood as major centers of scholarship. While often associated with Islamic learning, they also preserved mathematics, philosophy, medicine, and natural sciences. Students traveled from across Africa and the Mediterranean world to study there. Knowledge flowed in multiple directions. Africa was not a recipient of knowledge. Africa was a contributor. In Morocco, Al-Qarawiyyin University, founded in the 9th century by Fatima al-Fihri, an African woman, is recognized as one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world. Let that sink in. An African woman founded one of the world's earliest universities. That fact alone challenges everything many people were taught. Beyond North and West Africa, knowledge thrived in other forms. In Ethiopia, ancient centers of learning preserved philosophy, theology, astronomy, and medicine through the Ge'ez language. Ethiopian scholars documented history in written texts centuries before European colonization. In Central Africa, education was preserved through structured oral systems. Elders, healers, and specialists trained apprentices over many years. Knowledge was not casual, it was earned. In South Africa, Great Zimbabwe stood as evidence of advanced engineering, trade literacy, and architectural knowledge. The city's construction required mathematics, planning, and coordination. These were not isolated achievements. They were part of a continental pattern. Africa had libraries, but they did not all look the same. Some were buildings filled with manuscripts. Others were families who guarded texts like treasure. Others were elders whose memories carried centuries of law and history. In African societies, memory was sacred. A griot was not just a storyteller. A griot was an archive. Their training took decades. They memorized genealogies, treaties, wars, migrations, and laws with precision. To dismiss oral knowledge as unreliable is to misunderstand how disciplined it was. Africa did not lack record-keeping. It used different technologies. And here's why that matters. Colonization could not easily destroy oral libraries, which is why they survived. But written libraries were targeted. When colonization intensified, manuscripts were burned, stolen, or taken to foreign institutions. African knowledge was removed from African hands. Languages were suppressed. Local scholarship was discouraged. European education systems replaced African ones. Colonial schools provided just enough education to create clerks, translators, and administrators, not thinkers, historians, or philosophers. African history disappeared from classrooms. Africa began to appear only when Europeans arrived. Everything before that became silence. Even African universities were reframed. Timbuktu became a legend instead of a fact. African scholars became footnotes. Libraries became myths. This was not accidental. A people disconnected from their intellectual past are easier to dominate. But despite erasure, Africa's knowledge systems survived. Manuscripts were hidden in homes. Families risked their lives to protect texts. Scholars continued teaching quietly. In recent decades, thousands of Timbuktu manuscripts have been recovered and preserved, revealing the depth of African scholarship. They showed debates about human rights, discussions of women's roles, scientific observations of eclipses, legal arguments about justice and governance. This was African thought, complex, nuanced, and human. Africa's ancient universities did not exist to copy others. They existed to serve their societies. Education was tied to responsibility. Knowledge was not separate from ethics. Learning was meant to strengthen community, not individual dominance. This contrasts very sharply with colonial education, which prioritized extraction over balance. Africa's intellectual traditions valued harmony between people, nature, ancestors, and the future. That philosophy still lives in African cultures today. To say Africa had no universities is not just incorrect, it is dishonest. Africa's universities were different, but they were real. They were older than many European institutions. They educated scholars who influenced global thought. They preserved knowledge through centuries of change. Africa was never intellectually empty. It was deliberately emptied from the narrative. Reclaiming Africa's ancient universities and libraries is not about pride alone. It is about restoring continuity. When people know their intellectual ancestry, they walk differently into the future. Africa's past was not dark. It was illuminated by knowledge. And that light never fully went out. It was covered. Now it is being uncovered again. Inside Africa's ancient universities and libraries is a truth the world is still catching up to. Africa has always been thinking.